All right, welcome back to the share. We're going to keep talking about how the heart beats. In the last video, we talked about the action potentials that are propagated through the conducting cells of the heart in that sort of wave-like motion. We talked about the delay in between the action potential and the actual contraction. And that's kind of where we ended stuff. Now what we're going to do is get into the actual contracting part and look at the order that the different chambers contract, and then that'll get us into measuring volume and cardiac output and stuff like that. So the cardiac cycle is the cycle that the heart goes through from the start of one heartbeat to the beginning of the next heartbeat. And there's alternating periods of contraction and relaxation. Now, we have special terms for those, and you may have heard some of these numbers, especially if you've gone to the doctor or somebody you know has gone to the doctor, talking about different numbers for blood pressure numbers. So the two phases that we have, the contraction phase, the contraction phase is known as systole. The systolic pressure, that's one of the numbers. And diastole, that's the relaxation phase. That's the diastolic pressure. So those are those two numbers that you get. We'll talk about that in a little while, how we measure those. Blood pressure in each chamber is going to rise during systole. So each chamber, there's atrial systole and ventricular systole. So blood pressure is going to increase during systole. It's going to fall during diastole. And so that creates pressure differentials. And that's what's going to move blood. Pressure is going to build up in one chamber. And then those valves basically are going to release, allowing the blood to flow into chambers with lower pressure. These are controlled by the timing of the contractions that we sort of talked about in that last video. And the blood flow is directed by one-way valves. Now, you should have noted that those, like the semilunar valves and the AV valves, are sort of cup-shaped so that they prevent blood from flowing back into the previous chambers. Now, things like heart murmurs are when valves don't, or mitral regurgitation, your valves are not working properly, and so blood is allowed to backflow into other chambers. The cardiac cycle at about 75 beats per minute, the entire cycle lasts 800 milliseconds, so just under a second, basically. When the heart rate increases, all of the phases of the cardiac cycle shorten. In particular, the diastole, those relaxation phases, shorten. Here is an overview that we're going to look at in a little bit greater detail. And so the phases, if you look at this, of the cardiac cycle are atrial systole and atrial diastole. And there's overlap as well. So while we have atrial systole taking place, the atrium relaxing, we have ventricular systole right here. And then while during ventricular diastole, we actually start over again with the atrial systole. So while one chamber is relaxing, another one's contracting, vice versa. So let's break this down a little bit and really dig into what's going on. So at the start of our cycle, our atrial contraction begins. That's atrial systole. The right and left AV valves are open, and the atria push blood into the ventricles, as seen by the diagram right here. From there, atrial systole, which is pretty short, ends, and atrial diastole begins. This is also going to coincide with ventricular systole. At this point, the ventricles are going to contain their maximum blood volume, which is known as EDV, end diastolic volume. Wrong one. There we go. Okay, so from here then, during ventricular systole, that's the contraction phase, the ventricles are going to contract and begin to build up pressure. That's going to close those AV valves. If you notice, we've got those little cups. So as that pressure is going to build, that's going to push against those valves, holding them closed so they can't push backwards. Okay, so this is going to cause something known as isovolumetric contraction, which basically means we have a buildup of pressure caused by the contraction of the ventricular walls, but there's not going to be a corresponding change in the volume of the blood inside of the ventricle. From there, the contraction will continue to increase, which is going to increase that pressure, and then eventually there will be enough pressure that it's going to actually open up the semilunar valves. That's going to lead to ventricular ejection, and the blood is going to exit through the major vessels, either the aorta or the pulmonary trunk. The amount of blood ejected at this stage is known as the stroke volume. Now some of these acronyms we're going to come back to in a little while when we're talking about cardiac output. So at the end of ventricular systole, which also marks the beginning of ventricular diastole, the semilunar valves are going to close, and this is going to be caused because of a drop in the blood pressure in the ventricles. The ventricles are now going to contain the end systolic volume, that volume of blood that was in from the atria. This volume is about 40% of the end diastolic volume that we had just mentioned. From there, we have isovolumetric relaxation. So all the heart valves are closed at this point. The pressure in the ventricles is higher than the pressure in the atria, so that's going to prevent blood from flowing back into the ventricles, and blood is going to begin to flow into the relaxed atria. All right, so blood has flowed into the atria. The AV valves now will open, allowing the ventricles to begin to fill passively. That's because atrial pressure is higher than ventricular pressure. Now, it is important to note that people can survive from severe atrial damage because the atria, because of this, the passive movement, you can have atrial damage and still survive, because all the atria do is just move blood into the ventricles. The issues is if you have ventricular damage, that can lead to heart failure and death. So, like, typically the heart attacks that are really bad are going to be ventricular damage. You may also have atrial damage, but atrial damage by itself is not necessarily life-threatening. Here is a breakdown. This is a graph, and now this also corresponds with the EKG, with what we see with the conducting system. But this looks at pressure changes and volume changes. So if we look at here, the atrial contraction begins right here. Pressure is pretty low. Atria is going to eject blood into the ventricles, not that much higher. That's going to correspond with that P wave right there. It's a little bit afterwards. Then the left AV valve closes and we start to have ventricular contraction over here. So that's why we have this big spike right there. That's sort of lining up. That's a little after that big spike right there with the QRS complex. From there, the pressure in the aorta runs about here-ish. And so once the pressure in the ventricle is greater than what's in the aorta, then that aortic valve opens, allowing blood to go through. Where it peaks right there at the ventricle, then you're going to start to have a decrease in volume that's going to cause the semilunar valve to close. Isovolumetric relaxation is going to occur right here, allowing that eventually allowing that blood to come back into the heart right there, with the AV valves opening up. And then it starts over again. Here, this little hump right here is our first two spots right there. And you can hear all of this stuff. So when you go to the doctor and they're listening to your heart, what they're doing is they're listening for these contractions and listening for these valve openings and valve closings here in those four spots. And so there's very particular locations where they're listening to your heart that they're looking for. And so when they're listening for these are the locations that they put the stethoscope when they're listening for the valves opening and closing. And that's where we get that sort of distinctive lub-dub or lub-dub sound, because what we're listening for are the valves opening and closing. So S1, that really loud lub, that's actually when the AV valves are closing. So this section right here is the lub part, and then the dup, the next part right here, is when the semilunar valves close. So that's this section right here. And then the softer sounds that you hear, like right here and right here, that's the blood flowing into the ventricles and due to the atrial contraction. And then you can also hear heart murmurs. And so heart murmurs are, they sort of murmuring sound because you're hearing regurgitation. And regurgitation is basically fluid going back up a tube that it went down. So when you were regurgitating, when you're throwing up, food is supposed to go down. If you regurgitate food, you bring it back up backwards. And so if you have regurgitation in your heart, blood is supposed to go from atrium to ventricle. If you have regurgitation, like mitral regurgitation, blood is going from the ventricle back into the atrium, which, I mean, heart murmurs are not life-threatening, but, they can become life-threatening. And so, if you're aware of a heart murmur, your doctor's going to listen for it and see if it changes and stuff like that. Okay, so one of the things that doctors are interested in measuring as far as the indication of health and stuff like that is the cardiac output. Your cardiac output is how much blood your heart pumps. Now specifically, we're looking at the volume of blood pumped from the left ventricle. That's the one that's got to do the most work, so we're most concerned about the health of that ventricle. And you can calculate cardiac output by measuring the heart rate. So if you've ever put two fingers right here and you count 1, 2, 3, 4, so on and so forth. And there's various estimations you can do. If you want to do your beats per minute, you count how many beats are in 6 seconds and you multiply by 10. And that gives you your estimated beats per minute. And then we're also looking at our stroke volume. Now our stroke volume can be found by our end diastolic volume minus our end systolic volume that we had mentioned in the cardiac cycle section. If you multiply those two numbers together, that gives you your cardiac output, the volume of blood that your ventricle is moving. Your stroke volume is like I said, it's the end diastolic volume. That's the amount of blood in each ventricle at the end of ventricular diastole. So this section right here. And that's minus the end systolic volume, which is the amount of blood remaining in each ventricle at the end of ventricular systole. You want your ventricles to eject as much blood as possible, okay? That a very large difference between those will suggest that your heart is healthy and it's strong and it's moving a lot of blood out. And so basically, if you look at your heart, your heart is a pump. So if you look at your heart with a pump with one-way valves like we have here, diastole corresponds with raising the pump, creating negative pressure, and filling the pumping chamber. When you stop lifting that plunger, that's your end diastolic volume, the maximum volume of blood that chamber is holding. Then you start pumping, so you push down on that plunger, you're increasing the pressure, forcing the blood out through those semilunar valves into the major blood vessels. Once that contraction is completed, you've completely depressed that plunger. The blood volume, the blood that's left in the ventricle after that contraction is completed, is the end systolic volume. And so the difference between those is the stroke volume, the total amount of blood that is being pushed out. You multiply that by the heart rate, how many times per minute that ventricle is squeezing that blood out, you get your cardiac output. Factors that affect your heart rate. Age. Typically your heart rate's going to decrease as you get older. Fitness level. The more fit you are, the lower your heart rate. Hormones, autonomic innervation are all going to either increase or decrease heart rate. Factors affecting stroke volume include heart size. Bigger hearts have bigger volume. Fitness level, gender. Males typically have larger hearts, for example. Duration of the contraction, how long it lasts, and stuff like that. So exercise strengthens your heart, which can increases your stroke volume, decreases your heart rate. So that sort of breaks even with the cardiac output, and your heart actually works less, and there's less stress on the heart with a lower heart rate and higher stroke volume. This is one of the things that's really sort of important that we're going to get into with some of the project stuff that we'll talk about later once I get all those details finalized. But we're going to be really looking at this sort of thing, and what are some things that you can do to change the fitness level with the hormones and the autonomic innervation to sort of consciously adjust heart rate. But also, mention changing your fitness level with the stroke volume, bringing awareness about heart size and stuff like that. And I'll have more details about that a little bit later. But this was a sort of a run through of how the heart works. If you have any questions, let me know. Send me a remind message. Send me an email. Ask me in class. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing y'all again soon.